Sometimes the people we think we know best hide the deepest secrets. When a man inherits only a rotting barn from the uncle who abandoned him, he expects disappointment, not a discovery that will change everything he thought he knew. Caleb Vance finds a town that mocked his hermit uncle and a barn locals swear is empty. But his dog refuses to leave, scratching frantically at the old weathered floor. Beneath the boards lies a hidden cellar and an iron safe from the First National Bank, untouched since the Phantom Gang robbery 30 years ago. His uncle wasn't just a recluse. He was the Phantom himself. What will Caleb do with $100,000 in stolen gold? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, plain white envelope with a return address from a law firm Caleb had never heard of. He'd been mending fence on the eastern pasture when his neighbor's boy brought it out, and the sight of legal letterhead made his stomach tighten, the way it always did when the past came calling. Caleb, Rusty Vance, though nobody had called him Rusty in 20 years, set down his wire cutters and wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his work glove. At 48, he still had the build of a working man, lean and weathered like the fence posts he was repairing. His hands bore the scars of a lifetime spent with cattle and horses, and his face had been carved into permanent squint lines from decades under the Wyoming sun. Sarge, his 6-year-old blue heeler, watched from the shade of his truck with those intelligent eyes that seemed to read every emotion that crossed Caleb's face. The dog had been his constant companion since the divorce, and there were days when Caleb suspected Sarge understood him better than any person ever had. The letter was brief and formal. Raymond Vance had passed away 3 months prior. As his only living relative, Caleb was the sole beneficiary of his uncle's estate, such as it was. The lawyer, a man named Douglas Pritchett, requested Caleb's presence in Cedar Ridge, Montana, to settle the matter of the inheritance. There was a property, he wrote, though he cautioned that expectations should be modest. Caleb folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his shirt pocket. Raymond Vance, Uncle Ray. He hadn't seen the man in 32 years, not since Caleb's father Raymond's younger brother had died when Caleb was 16. There'd been a falling out at the funeral, harsh words spoken in grief that had never been taken back. Raymond had disappeared into the Montana wilderness, and the family had let him go. Over the years, the silence had calcified into something permanent, and eventually Caleb had stopped wondering about the uncle who'd chosen solitude over family. Now Raymond was gone, and apparently Caleb owned whatever remained of a life lived in isolation. He finished the fence work as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western mountains. The physical labor helped him think, always had. His own ranch, 200 acres of struggling grassland and stubborn cattle, wasn't much, but it was honest work. After the marriage fell apart and his ex-wife moved to Denver with their grown daughter, Caleb had found a certain peace in the simplicity of his days. Wake before dawn, tend the animals, mend what broke, and sleep the dreamless sleep of the exhausted. But the letter had disturbed that peace, stirring up memories he'd thought were settled like old sediment at the bottom of a pond. That evening, he called the lawyer's office and arranged to make the trip the following week. Pritchett sounded relieved, as though he'd expected Caleb to refuse the inheritance entirely. "It's not much," the lawyer said again, his voice apologetic. "A piece of land, maybe 5 acres. There was a house, but it burned down about 15 years ago. There's an old barn still standing, but I'll be honest with you, Mr. Vance, it's not worth the property taxes you'll owe on it." "I'll come see it anyway," Caleb said. He wasn't sure why, except that it felt like something a man ought to do when his last blood relative passed on. The drive to Cedar Ridge took him through country he'd never seen before, high pine forests giving way to rolling grassland dotted with ancient cottonwoods. It was beautiful, in that stark, lonely way that Montana could be, and Caleb found himself wondering what had drawn Raymond to this particular corner of the world. Sarge rode in the passenger seat, his head out the window, ears flapping in the wind. The dog had taken to travel well, and Caleb appreciated the company. Talking to Sarge had become a habit over the years. The dog never interrupted, never judged, and never offered advice Caleb didn't ask for. "Your great-uncle Ray was a strange one," Caleb told the dog, as they passed a hand-painted sign welcoming them to Cedar Ridge, population 847. "Dad used to say he was too smart for his own good. Always had his nose in a book, always asking questions nobody wanted to answer. Dad was the practical one, Ray was the dreamer. Guess it didn't work out so well for him in the end." Sarge turned his head and looked at Caleb with those knowing eyes, then went back to watching the landscape blur past. Cedar Ridge was the kind of town that time had gently forgotten. Main Street featured a hardware store, a diner with a faded red awning, a post office, and a bar called the Stockman's Rest. The law office of Pritchett and Associates occupied the second floor of the only brick building in town, above what had once been a bank but now served as an antique shop. Douglas Pritchett was a man in his late 60s, with steel-grey hair and the careful manner of someone who'd spent a lifetime delivering bad news gently. He shook Caleb's hand with genuine warmth and offered coffee, which Caleb accepted. They sat in an office that smelled of old paper and furniture polish, and Pritchett laid out the details of Raymond's estate with the precision of a man who believed in thoroughness. "Your uncle lived very simply," Pritchett explained, sliding a thin folder across the desk. "No debts, no assets beyond the property. He worked odd jobs around town, carpentry, mostly, kept to himself. People here knew him as a quiet man, reliable if you needed something fixed, but not one for socializing. He was like that as a kid too," Caleb said, surprising himself with the memory. "Always tinkering with things, taking them apart to see how they worked." Pritchett nodded. "That sounds right. He did beautiful work. There are houses all over this county with cabinets and trim he built." The lawyer paused, choosing his words carefully. "I'll be frank, Mr. Vance. Most people in town thought your uncle was a bit odd. He never explained why he came here, never talked about his past. In a small town like this, that kind of privacy makes people curious, and curiosity can turn into gossip. There were rumors, nothing substantial, but well, people wondered. Wondered what? If he was running from something, if he'd done something he regretted." Pritchett spread his hands. "Nothing based in fact, mind you. Your uncle never caused any trouble, paid his bills, did good work, bothered no one. But loneliness makes a man mysterious, and mystery makes people invent stories." Caleb thought about that as he signed the necessary papers. A man could work his whole life, do everything right, and still end up the subject of small-town speculation simply because he chose to keep his own counsel. It seemed a lonely way to live, but then again, Caleb's own life wasn't so different these days. The property was 10 miles outside town, down a dirt road that wound through stands of aspen and pine. Pritchett had offered to accompany him, but Caleb declined. Whatever he found out there, he wanted to face it alone, with just Sarge for company. The land revealed itself gradually as the road climbed a gentle rise. 5 acres of overgrown grass, bordered by a split-rail fence that had mostly collapsed. The foundation of the burned house was still visible, a rectangular scar in the earth filled with charred timber and broken stone. But it was the barn that drew Caleb's attention immediately. It stood alone in the center of the clearing, a structure that seemed far too substantial for such a modest property. Built from heavy timber that had weathered to a deep gray, it was windowless and solid, with a steep pitched roof that had somehow survived decades of mountain weather. The doors were massive, 12 feet tall, and reinforced with iron straps, and they were secured with a heavy padlock that looked new despite the rust on the door hinges. Caleb parked his truck and stepped out, Sarge immediately at his heels. The dog sniffed the air with interest, tail up, alert, but not alarmed. The property had that particular silence that comes with true isolation, no traffic noise, no neighbors, just whined through the pines and the distant call of a hawk. He walked slowly toward the barn, taking in the details. The construction was remarkable, built to last by someone who knew their craft. But it was strange, too, why build something so substantial in the middle of nowhere, and why no windows? The whole structure had the feeling of a fortress or a vault. The padlock was modern, probably replaced within the last few years. Caleb tried his truck keys on a hunch, but none fit. He walked around the entire perimeter of the barn, looking for another entrance or a weak point, but the structure was sealed tight. There weren't even gaps between the boards wide enough to see through. Sarge followed him around the barn, sniffing at the base of the walls with professional interest. When they completed the circuit and returned to the front doors, the dog sat down and looked up at Caleb with an expression that seemed to say, "Well, what now?" "Good question, boy," Caleb muttered. He returned to his truck and retrieved a toolbox from the bed, then selected a heavy bolt cutter. The padlock was thick, but the cutters were industrial grade, and after a few minutes of effort, the lock gave way with a satisfying snap. The chain fell away, and Caleb grasped the iron handle of the right-hand door. It took all his weight to pull it open. The hinges screamed in protest after years of disuse, but finally the door swung wide enough for him to enter. Darkness and the smell of old wood greeted him. Caleb pulled out his phone and activated the flashlight, sweeping the beam across the interior. The barn was empty, completely, utterly empty. No tools, no equipment, no stored belongings. Just bare wooden floors covered in dust and what looked like animal droppings, probably from mice and rats that had found their way in through gaps in the roof. The locals had been right. The barn was nothing, a strange monument to wasted effort. Caleb felt a wave of something like disappointment, though he wasn't sure what he'd expected. Answers, maybe. Some insight into why Raymond had lived the way he did, died alone, and left nothing behind but an empty building in the middle of nowhere. He was about to leave when Sarge pushed past him into the barn, nose to the ground, working in that intense way he had when tracking. The dog went straight to the back wall and stopped, whining softly. "What is it, boy?" Caleb followed him, shining his light on the wall. It looked the same as the others' old planks, some gaps, nothing unusual. But Sarge wouldn't leave, kept whining and pawing at the floor. Caleb trusted his dog's instincts more than his own most days. He knelt down and examined the floorboards more carefully. At first, he saw nothing, but then his light caught something, a slight difference in the wood color, a pattern that didn't quite match the rest of the floor. He pressed down on one board and felt it give slightly, not like rot, but like it wasn't nailed down. His pulse quickened. He ran his fingers along the edge of the board and found a small gap, just wide enough to get a grip. The board lifted away easily, and beneath it was another, and another, all loose, forming a hidden square about 4 feet on each side. Beneath the false floor was darkness, and a smell that was different from the barn, cooler, danker, like earth that hadn't seen sun in a very long time. Caleb went back to his truck for a proper flashlight and a pry bar. When he returned, Sarge was still there, tail wagging now, excited by the discovery. Together, they removed the rest of the loose boards, revealing a rough wooden ladder descending into blackness. "Well," Caleb said softly, his voice echoing slightly in the empty barn, "I guess we're going down." The ladder was solid despite its age, built from the same heavy timber as the barn. Caleb descended carefully, Sarge whining anxiously above him. The cellar, because that's what it clearly was about 12 feet deep and perhaps 10 feet square, carved directly out of the earth and shored up with timber supports. And in the center of the hidden room, lit by the beam of Caleb's flashlight, stood a massive iron safe, untouched by time, its dark surface gleaming dully in the light. Caleb's breath caught in his throat. He moved closer, and the light revealed more details. The safe was old, ornate even, with elaborate scrollwork around the edges and a combination dial in the center. But it was the seal at the top that made his blood run cold. Embossed in the metal, still clearly visible after all these years, were the words, "First National Bank of Cedar Ridge, established 1890. Caleb had seen that exact seal before. There was a photograph in the antique shop downstairs from Pritchett's office, part of a display about local history. The same bank seal, the same ornate styling. The bank that had been robbed in 1963 by the Phantom Gang, a heist that had made national news. Over $100,000 in gold certificates, taken in broad daylight by men who disappeared like ghosts. The case had never been solved. The money had never been recovered. And the local legend, because every small town had its legends, was that the Phantom had been one man, not a gang at all, someone smart enough and patient enough to wait out the heat, to hide his time until the world forgot. Caleb stood in the hidden cellar beneath his uncle's barn, staring at a safe that hadn't seen daylight in over 30 years, and felt the ground shift beneath his feet. Everything he thought he knew about Raymond Vance, everything his father had told him, every assumption he'd made about the quiet, odd man who'd chosen exile over family, all of it was suddenly, irrevocably wrong. His uncle hadn't been running from something, he'd been hiding something, and Caleb was standing right in front of it. Caleb climbed back up the ladder on legs that felt uncertain, his mind racing faster than his heartbeat. Sarge greeted him with tail wags and concerned whines, sensing his agitation. He sat on the dusty barn floor for a long time, flashlight still in hand, trying to process what he'd found. The safe was real. The seal was real. And unless he was losing his mind, the implications were impossible to ignore. He drove back to Cedar Ridge as the sun touched the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. The beauty felt surreal against the turmoil in his thoughts. Sarge sat quietly in the passenger seat, as if understanding that this was not a time for the usual companionable chatter. The Cedar Ridge Public Library occupied a small building next to the post office, and Caleb was relieved to find it still open. The librarian, a woman in her 70s with kind eyes and silver hair pinned in a neat bun, looked up from her desk with a welcoming smile. "Help you find something?" she asked. "I'm looking for information about the old bank robbery," Caleb said, then added, "The one from the 60s, the Phantom Gang." Her expression shifted to something more guarded, though her smile remained. "That's quite a piece of local history." "Something like that. I inherited some property here, and I'm just curious about the town's past." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Follow me." The library's historical section was modest, but well organized. The librarian pulled out several bound volumes of the Cedar Ridge Chronicle, the local newspaper that had ceased publication in 1987, June of '63, she said, laying the volume on a reading table. It was all anyone talked about for months. She left him alone with the papers, and Caleb began to read. The robbery had occurred on June 14th, a Friday morning. 3 men, faces covered with bandanas, had entered the First National Bank at opening time. The manager, 2 tellers, and 4 customers had been present. No shots were fired, no one was hurt, but the robbers had been professional and efficient. They knew exactly what they wanted, the bank's collection of gold certificates stored in the main vault for a planned transfer to the Federal Reserve in Helena the following Monday. $112,000 in gold certificates, gone in less than 8 minutes. The newspapers from the following weeks detailed the investigation. The FBI had been called in. Roadblocks had been set up across 3 counties. Every hotel, boarding house, and known associate of anyone with a criminal record had been searched. But the thieves had vanished completely, leaving no trace beyond conflicting witness descriptions and a single clue, a playing card, the Phantom, left on the bank manager's desk. Hence the name the press had given them, the Phantom Gang. But as Caleb read deeper into the coverage, he noticed something interesting. While early reports mentioned 3 robbers, later articles began questioning whether all 3 had been real. One witness said she'd only seen 2 men, clearly. Another said one of the figures had moved strangely, perhaps had been a mannequin or dummy, meant to make the group seem larger. A third witness, elderly and admittedly confused by the chaos, insisted there had been only 1 robber, moving so quickly between positions that he'd seemed like 3. The FBI had dismissed this theory, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Over the years, as the case remained unsolved, local legend had transformed the story. The Phantom Gang became the Phantom, a singular figure of near-mythical cunning who had orchestrated the perfect crime and disappeared into the mountains with a fortune. Caleb found a later article from 1975, revisiting the case on its 12th anniversary. The journalist had interviewed the retired bank manager, who said something that made Caleb's hands tighten on the yellowed newsprint. Whoever he was patient. Smarter than us, smarter than the FBI. He knew that gold certificates don't expire, that they'd always be worth something. And he knew that the heat would die down eventually. If he was smart enough to pull it off, he was smart enough to wait. Could be living among us right now, just an ordinary fellow, biding his time. The article included a photograph of the bank's exterior, taken before the building was converted to the antique shop. And there, unmistakable even in the grainy black and white image, was the ornate seal that Caleb had seen on the safe. He carefully photographed several pages with his phone, then returned the volumes to the librarian with thanks. Outside, the evening had turned cool, and Main Street was quiet except for a few patrons entering the Stockman's Rest. Caleb stood on the sidewalk, looking at the antique shop that had once been the First National Bank, and felt the weight of what he'd discovered settle over him like a physical thing. His uncle Raymond had come to Cedar Ridge in late 1963, according to Pritchett. He'd arrived with enough money to buy 5 acres of land outright and build a barn that was over-engineered for any practical purpose. He'd worked odd jobs, kept to himself, and never left town for more than a day or two at a time. Never long enough to draw suspicion, never short enough of money to seem desperate, just a quiet, skilled carpenter who preferred his own company. And, beneath his barn, hidden in a cellar that could only be found by someone who knew exactly where to look, sat the proceeds of the most famous unsolved robbery in Montana history. Caleb felt a strange mix of emotions. There was shock, certainly, and a kind of reluctant admiration for the sheer audacity of what his uncle had done. But there was also anger. Anger at the deception, at the wasted relationship, at a man who had chosen a stolen fortune over his own family. His father had died broke, working himself into an early grave on a failing ranch. Caleb himself had struggled for years, watching his marriage crumble under financial stress, taking loans he could barely afford to keep his small herd fed through hard winters. And all that time, Raymond had been sitting on more money than either of them would see in a lifetime of honest work. The anger felt righteous, but it was complicated by another truth. His uncle had never spent the money. He'd lived as poorly as any of them, maybe worse. If the safe still held what it was supposed to hold, then Raymond had committed the perfect crime and then refused to enjoy the fruits of it. He'd sentenced himself to isolation and poverty, guarding a secret that had consumed his entire life. Why? That question gnawed at Caleb as he drove back to the motel where he'd checked in that afternoon. Sarge sensed his mood and pressed close against his leg as they walked to the room. Caleb ordered a burger from the diner and sat on the bed, his laptop open, searching for more information about the robbery, about his uncle, about anything that might explain the inexplicable. He found very little. Raymond Vance had left almost no footprint, no criminal record, no known associates, no trail before Cedar Ridge. It was as if he'd been born the day he arrived in Montana, a fully formed adult with cash in hand and secrets in his heart. The food arrived, and Caleb ate mechanically, his mind elsewhere. Sarge finished his own dinner and settled on the floor with a contented sigh, the only creature in the room at peace. Caleb lay awake for a long time that night, staring at the ceiling of the cheap motel room. He kept coming back to the same question. What was he supposed to do now? The right thing, the legal thing, would be to call the authorities. The money was stolen. It belonged well. To whom did it belong after 62 years? The bank no longer existed. The insurance company that had paid out the claim was probably long dissolved. The victims were all dead or too old to care. But it was still stolen. That fact didn't change just because time had passed. On the other hand, His uncle had left him the property knowing, or at least hoping, that Caleb would eventually discover what lay beneath the barn. There had to be a reason for that. Raymond had kept the secret his entire adult life, had died without revealing it to anyone. Why give Caleb the burden of that knowledge now? Unless it wasn't meant to be a burden, unless it was meant to be a gift, or maybe a chance at something Raymond himself had never taken the opportunity to choose a different path. Morning found Caleb no closer to answers, but certain of one thing: he needed to open that safe. Whatever was inside, whatever his uncle had hidden there for over 3 decades, Caleb had to see it with his own eyes. Only then could he decide what kind of man he wanted to be in the face of temptation and legacy. He checked out of the motel, loaded Sarge into the truck, and drove back to his uncle's property. The barn looked the same as it had the day before, solid and secretive under the morning sun. But now Caleb saw it differently, not as a monument to eccentricity, but as a carefully constructed vault, built by a man who understood that the most important secrets are the ones hidden in plain sight. The safe was waiting in the darkness below, and with it, the truth about Raymond Vance and the choice that would define what came next. The combination lock on the safe was a mechanical marvel, even by modern standards. Caleb spent the better part of the morning examining it by flashlight in the hidden cellar, running his fingers over the dial, feeling the precision clicks as he turned it. The numbers went from 0 to 99, and the lock required 4 numbers in exact sequence. The mathematics of it were staggering, 100 million possible combinations. He tried the obvious ones first, feeling foolish even as he did so. Birthdays, the year of the robbery, simple sequences. Nothing. The safe remained stubbornly locked, its secrets sealed behind iron and engineering. Sarge had grown bored with the cellar and waited above, occasionally appearing at the edge of the opening to check on Caleb with worried eyes. The dog's presence was a comfort, a reminder that whatever happened down here, the world above continued as normal, simple, honest, uncomplicated. By noon, Caleb climbed back up and sat on the barn floor, his back against the wall, thinking. He could hire a professional safecracker, but that would mean revealing what he'd found. He could try to move the safe, but it had to weigh close to 1,000 pounds, and getting it up the ladder would be impossible without equipment. He could walk away entirely, fill in the hole, and forget he'd ever found it. But he knew he wouldn't do that. Not yet. Not until he understood why his uncle had done this, had lived the way he had died alone rather than spending even a fraction of the fortune he'd stolen. Caleb decided to learn more about Raymond's life in Cedar Ridge. If he couldn't open the safe, maybe he could open the mystery of the man who'd hidden it. The hardware store on Main Street was run by a man named Frank Holloway, who looked to be in his late 70s and had the weathered appearance of someone who'd spent a lifetime in honest labor. When Caleb introduced himself as Raymond Vance's nephew, Frank's expression softened immediately. "Ray Vance," he said, shaking his head with what seemed like genuine fondness. "Fine man. Did beautiful work. You here to settle the estate?" "Something like that," Caleb said. "I'm trying to understand what kind of man my uncle was. We lost touch a long time ago." Frank nodded sympathetically. "Families drift apart sometimes. That's a shame, though. Ray was good people, quiet, kept to himself, but reliable as sunrise. If he told you he'd have a job done Tuesday, it was done Monday afternoon." "What kind of work did he do for you?" "Custom cabinets, mostly. Shelving units, display cases. I've got a whole back room of inventory racks he built in '74. Still solid as the day he finished them." Frank gestured for Caleb to follow and led him to the storeroom. The work was immediately visible: clean joints, perfect alignment, wood that had aged beautifully but showed no signs of weakness. "He learned this somewhere," Caleb said, running his hand along a shelf joint. "This is master-level carpentry." He never said where, but yeah, he knew his craft, had his own tools, beautiful old pieces that he kept in perfect condition. Had this level that must have been from the 20s or 30s, brass and rosewood, accurate to a hair. Frank smiled at the memory. He'd show up for a job with that level, and you knew whatever he built would be true. Caleb felt something shift in his understanding. His uncle hadn't just been hiding time between the robbery and some eventual payoff. He'd been working, creating, building things that lasted, things that had value beyond money. Did he ever talk about his past, where he came from? Frank shook his head. Not to me. I asked once, early on, just making conversation. He got real quiet. Said something like, the past is for learning from, not living in, and changed the subject. I didn't push. Figured a man's entitled to his privacy. Over the next few days, Caleb talked to others who'd known Raymond. The pattern was consistent. Everyone remembered him as skilled, reliable, and intensely private. He'd done work all over the county. There were bookcases in the library, pews he'd repaired at the Presbyterian church, a complete kitchen renovation in the home of a widow who spoke of him with tears in her eyes. He wouldn't take full payment, she said. I was struggling after my husband passed, and Ray knew it. He did 3 months of work and charged me for materials plus a little extra. When I tried to pay him what it was worth, he just smiled and said good work was its own reward. She looked at Caleb earnestly. Your uncle was a kind man, Mr. Vance. I hope you know that. Caleb thanked her and left, feeling more confused than ever. The Raymond that these people described didn't match his image of a calculating thief. This was a man who'd built community even while keeping himself apart from it, who'd charged fair prices when he could have asked for more, who'd put care and pride into work that would outlast him. Why would such a man rob a bank? He returned to the barn in the afternoons, descending into the cellar with his flashlight, sitting beside the safe as if proximity might reveal its secrets. He'd brought a notebook and started writing down everything he knew about his uncle, looking for patterns, for clues that might lead to the combination. Raymond had been born in 1934, died in 2024 at 90 years old. The robbery had been in 1963, when he would have been 29. Young enough to be bold, old enough to plan carefully. His father, Caleb's grandfather, had been a railroad man, a detail Caleb remembered from family stories. Raymond had been the smart one, the one who'd gone to college for a year before dropping out. Nobody had ever said why he'd quit. Caleb wrote down dates, ages, possible significant numbers. He tried combinations based on his grandfather's birthday, his father's birthday, even his own. Nothing worked. The safe remained locked. On the 4th day, while examining the barn's construction more carefully, Caleb found something he'd missed before. Hidden in the shadows of the rafters, tucked into a gap between 2 beams, was a small wooden box, barely 6 inches square. It was wedged in tight, and he had to use a stepladder from his truck to reach it. The box was made of the same careful craftsmanship as everything else Raymond had built: dovetail joints, a fitted lid, smooth finish. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a carpenter's level. Not the modern plastic kind, but an old brass and rosewood beauty, exactly as Frank had described. The brass was polished to a warm glow, and the wood had been maintained with such care that it looked almost new despite its age. Caleb held it up to the light streaming through the barn door. Along the brass plate, engraved in careful script, were the words, R.M. Vance, 1892. His great-great-grandfather's level, a tool that had been in the family for over a century, passed down through generations of men who'd built things with their hands. Raymond had kept it, maintained it, hidden it away like everything else of value in his life. Caleb turned the level over in his hands, feeling its weight, its balance. On the underside of the wooden body, carved in tiny letters that were almost invisible unless you knew to look, was a date, the 14th of June, 2063, the day of the robbery. His hands trembled slightly as he set the level down on the dusty barn floor. Raymond had marked this tool, this piece of family heritage, with the date he'd changed his life forever. It was the only personal effect Caleb had found, the only thing Raymond had chosen to preserve beyond the stolen money. What did that mean? That he'd valued the connection to honest work, to family tradition, even as he'd betrayed everything it represented? Or that he'd wanted to remember the moment when he'd made a choice that couldn't be unmade, a marker of the day when Raymond Vance the carpenter became Raymond Vance the phantom? Caleb sat in the barn, the level beside him, Sarge's warm presence against his leg, and felt the weight of inherited choices pressing down on him. His uncle had lived with this secret for 61 years, had carried it alone until death. Now it was Caleb's burden, and he still didn't know what to do with it. The afternoon sun slanted through the barn door, painting everything in shades of amber and gold. Somewhere outside, a meadowlark sang its evening song, and beneath the floor, in darkness and silence, the safe waited with impatience that matched the decades Raymond had given it. Caleb couldn't bring himself to leave Cedar Ridge. He extended his stay at the motel, making excuses to himself about needing to thoroughly inspect the property, to make decisions about the land. But the truth was simpler. He was caught between two worlds, unable to move forward or back. His daughter called on the 6th day, her voice bright with the oblivious cheer of someone whose life was uncomplicated by moral quandaries. "Hey, Dad, just checking in. How's Montana?" It's fine, honey, beautiful country. Have you figured out what you're going to do with Uncle Ray's place?" Caleb looked out the motel window at the mountains in the distance. "Still working on that." "Well, don't spend too much on it if it's not worth anything. Mom says you're too sentimental sometimes, that you hold on to things you should let go of." He smiled despite himself. His ex-wife had said that often during their marriage, usually while watching him repair some piece of equipment that would have been cheaper to replace. "Your mom's probably right about that." They talked for a few more minutes about her job, her apartment, the life she was building in Denver that didn't include room for an aging rancher father who talked to his dog. When she hung up, Caleb felt the familiar ache of distance, not just miles but the growing gulf between generations, between the choices he'd made and the ones she would make. He returned to the property that afternoon with renewed purpose. If he couldn't open the safe, maybe he could find something else Raymond had left behind, some explanation or instruction. The barn revealed nothing new, but he hadn't thoroughly searched the house foundation. What remained of Raymond's home was mostly ash and broken stone, but one corner of the foundation had a partial cellar that had survived the fire. Caleb hadn't explored it before it had seemed too unstable, too dangerous. But now he lowered himself carefully into the space, Sarge watching anxiously from above. The cellar was small, maybe 6 feet by 8, and the ceiling was only 5 feet high, forcing Caleb to crouch. Charred wood and debris covered most of the floor, but against one wall was a metal filing cabinet, scorched but intact. The drawers were stuck, swollen from heat and moisture, but with effort Caleb managed to pry the top drawer open. Inside were papers, miraculously preserved by the metal cabinet. Tax returns going back 20 years, all meticulously filed. Receipts for materials and tools. Records of every job Raymond had done. Every payment received, documented with the same precision he'd brought to his carpentry. The man had lived like a monk, spending almost nothing, saving small amounts that added up to a modest bank account, all legal, all taxed, all documented. It was the second drawer that yielded something more personal. A journal, leather-bound and worn, filled with Raymond's careful handwriting. Caleb carried it up into the daylight and sat on the truck's tailgate, Sarge beside him, and began to read. The entries weren't dated by day, but by year. Simple observations and thoughts that Raymond had committed to paper. 1965. Mrs. Peterson asked me to build shelves for her sewing room. She talks too much, but she's lonely. Husband died in the war. Made the shelves deeper than she asked. No extra charge. She'll need the space. 1972. Fix the church pews. Father Morrison thanked me, said I had a gift. Told him all I have is patience and the tools my great-grandfather left me. He said, sometimes that's all God requires. 1978. Saw a young couple looking at the old Johnson place. They have a baby. Not much money. Offered to help with repairs if they buy it. They looked at me like I was crazy. Maybe I am. Page after page of small kindnesses, observations about the town, notes about the work he'd done. Nothing about the robbery, nothing about the money. It was as if that part of his life existed in a separate reality, sealed away as completely as the safe in the cellar. But then, near the back of the journal, Caleb found an entry that made him stop breathing for a moment. 1989, 26 years. Half my life spent guarding something I'll never use. Sometimes I wonder what I've become, a watchman for my own sin, or a prisoner of it. The money sits in the dark, and I sit in the light, and neither of us is free. And later, what appeared to be the final entry, 2015. I'm getting old, hands shake sometimes when I work, had to turn down the Anderson kitchen job, can't trust myself with the finish work anymore. All those years of building things that last, and I'll be gone soon, leaving nothing but questions and a burden I can't bring myself to lift. I think about my brother often, about his boy, Caleb, about the choice I made that cost me a family. Maybe some debts can't be paid in money. Maybe some can only be paid in time. Caleb read the entry 3 more times, feeling his throat tighten. His uncle had thought about him, had carried the weight of their estrangement. The robbery hadn't just cost Raymond his freedom, it had cost him everything else too. Family connection, the simple right to live openly in the world. He was still sitting there, journal in hand, when a truck pulled up the dirt road. It was newer, a white Ford with county plates, and when the driver stepped out, Caleb recognized the bearing of law enforcement even before he saw the badge. "Afternoon," the man said, approaching with the careful friendliness of someone used to diffusing situations. He was maybe 60, with a weathered face and grey hair cut short. "I'm Sheriff Tom Bridger. You must be Ray Vance's nephew." "Caleb Vance," he said, shaking the offered hand while his heart hammered. Had someone seen him at the library? Had his questions raised suspicions? "Heard you were in town. Just wanted to introduce myself, see if you needed anything." Bridger's eyes scanned the property, taking in the barn, the foundation, Caleb's truck. Professional observation, nothing more. Ray was a good man. Town's going to miss him. "So I've heard. People have been kind, sharing their memories. He helped a lot of folks over the years, never asked for much in return." Bridger paused, seemed to choose his next words carefully. "I moved here in 95, so I didn't know him in his younger years. But the old-timers, they sometimes speculated about him. Man that private, that skilled, that careful, some wondered if he'd been in witness protection or something. Federal agents don't talk about such things, of course, but well, in a small town, people wonder." Caleb felt his pulse quicken but kept his expression neutral. "Did my uncle ever have trouble with the law? Not even a parking ticket. Model citizen, far as I know. I mention it only because, well, whatever brought him here, whatever he was running from or hiding from, it doesn't matter now. He paid his dues to this community in sweat and skill. Far as I'm concerned, Ray Vance died with a clean slate." They talked for a few more minutes about the property, about whether Caleb planned to keep it or sell. Bridger offered to help with contacts if he needed local contractors for any repairs. Finally, he tipped his hat and returned to his truck, leaving Caleb standing there with Raymond's journal still in his hand and a new understanding settling over him. The sheriff knew. Maybe not the specifics, maybe not the details, but he knew that Raymond Vance had carried secrets, and he'd chosen to let those secrets rest with the dead, offering the kind of grace that maybe Raymond had earned through 3 decades of quiet service. It was a generous interpretation, one that assumed the best of a man who'd made terrible choices and then spent a lifetime trying to balance some cosmic scale. But did good works erase theft? Did community service absolve criminality? These were questions beyond Caleb's ability to answer. He looked down at Sarge, who gazed back with those trusting eyes that expected nothing more than dinner and a warm place to sleep. The dog's needs were simple, honest, uncomplicated by morality or history. Caleb envied that simplicity, even as he knew he could never return to it. The journal went into his truck, along with the carpenter's level and the growing weight of his uncle's legacy. Tomorrow, he would try again to open the safe. Tonight, he would read more of Raymond's thoughts and try to understand how a man could be both thief and craftsman, both criminal and neighbor, both isolated and woven into the fabric of a community that never quite knew his true name. Caleb woke at dawn with a thought that had been circling his dreams. The combination had to mean something to Raymond personally, not just random numbers, but something significant enough that he could remember it without writing it down, yet obscure enough that no one else would guess it. He retrieved the journal from his truck and sat in the motel room, Sarge still sleeping on the floor, and read through every entry again, this time looking for numbers. There were few. Raymond hadn't been the type to record measurements or counts in his personal writings, but in one entry from 1970, Caleb found something. Built a bookcase today for the middle school library, 8 shelves, each 42 inches wide. The principal asked, why 42 specifically? Told her it was the perfect number. She laughed, said I was an odd duck. If she only knew. 42. The perfect number. Caleb felt a tingle of recognition. He'd heard that phrase before from his father, telling stories about his older brother's quirks. Raymond had been obsessed with Douglas Adams before Adams was even famous, had read some British science fiction magazine that serialized a story about the meaning of life, the universe, and everything. The answer was 42. It was the kind of inside joke Raymond would appreciate, a number that meant everything and nothing, depending on whether you knew the reference. Caleb drove to the barn as the sun painted the mountains in shades of rose and gold. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and wildflowers. Sarge bounded ahead, happy to be active after a night cooped up in the motel room. Down in the cellar, Caleb knelt before the safe and tried combinations starting with 42. Hours passed. His knees ached. His eyes strained in the flashlight beam, but he kept trying. 42 forward, 42 backward, 42 with other significant numbers, the year of the robbery, ages, dates, nothing. He climbed back up into the barn, frustrated and hungry. While eating a sandwich from the truck's cooler, he paced the length of the building, thinking the barn itself had to be part of the puzzle. Why build something this substantial just to hide a cellar? The construction was expensive, far more than necessary for simple concealment. Unless it wasn't just about hiding the safe. Unless it was about creating something permanent, something that would outlast Raymond himself. Caleb examined the barn's structure more carefully. The timber framing was masterwork, joints fitted so precisely they'd barely shifted after 60 years. The roof remained sound despite the harsh mountain winters. Every detail spoke of care and skill and permanence. He found himself thinking about the things Raymond had built for others. The shelves, the cabinets, the pews, all of it still standing, still useful, still serving the community decades after his hands had shaped the wood. His uncle had left marks all over Cedar Ridge, anonymous but enduring. Was that the point? Not to hide from his crime, but to build something that mattered more than the crime itself. The afternoon brought another visitor. This time it was a man in his early 50s, wearing an expensive jacket over designer jeans, driving a Tesla that looked wildly out of place on the dirt road. He introduced himself as Marcus Webb, a real estate developer from Missoula. "I heard Raymond Vance's property might be available," Webb said, his smile professionally friendly. "I represent a group interested in acquiring land in this area for a resort development. Small, exclusive, high-end cabins for wealthy tourists who want an authentic Montana experience." Caleb leaned against his truck, keeping his expression neutral. "That so? We'd be prepared to make a very generous offer. The land itself isn't worth much in its current state, but the location is excellent. Views, privacy, close enough to town, but far enough to feel remote." Webb gestured at the property. We'd tear down that old barn, clear the foundation, put up something that actually adds value. The barn stays, Caleb said, surprised by the firmness in his own voice. Webb's smile tightened slightly. Well, of course, that would be negotiable. But honestly, Mr. Vance, that structure is a liability. No windows, taking up prime building space. It would be better for everyone if it came down. I haven't decided to sell. Of course, take your time, but when you're ready, we'd be very interested. I'm staying in town for a few days. Here's my card. He handed over embossed cardstock with gold lettering. Think about it. That barn is just old wood and empty space. The money we're offering could change your life. After Webb left, Caleb sat on the truck's tailgate, turning the business card over in his hands. The offer was probably substantial. Webb had the look of someone used to winning, and the money would solve a lot of problems. His own ranch was struggling. He could pay off debts, maybe even retire early, spend his remaining years in comfort instead of constant worry about droughts and cattle prices. But the barn wasn't just old wood and empty space. It was Raymond's life's work, his monument, and his mausoleum. It held secrets that Webb couldn't begin to imagine, and destroying it felt like a betrayal of something Caleb didn't fully understand yet. He returned to the cellar that evening, determined to solve the combination. This time, he brought Raymond's journal with him, reading passages aloud to Sarge, who'd settled on the cellar floor like a furry sentry. In the journal's middle section, tucked between pages, Caleb found a yellowed newspaper clipping. It wasn't about the robbery, it was older, from 1958, a small article about a bank in Wyoming that had been robbed, and the thieves caught within hours because they'd panicked and made mistakes. Written in the margin, in Raymond's precise hand, were the words, "Patience, planning, never panic." The article was worn, folded and refolded many times, as if Raymond had studied it repeatedly. It was a blueprint, Caleb realized, or maybe a warning, a reminder of how not to commit a crime. His uncle had prepared for years, had researched and planned with the same careful attention he'd later bring to his carpentry. Caleb held the clipping up to the light. On the back, almost invisible, were faint pencil marks, numbers that had been erased but left ghostly impressions in the paper. He angled it different ways, trying to make them out. 4 sets of 2-digit numbers, 189234663. His heart raced. 1892, the year engraved on the family level, 34 Raymond's birth year, 63 the year of the robbery. Caleb descended to the safe, his hands trembling slightly. He turned the dial carefully, right to 18, left to 92, right to 34, left to 63. For a moment, nothing happened. Then he heard a soft click, felt the mechanism release. The handle turned. He pulled the heavy door open, and the flashlight beam revealed the interior of the safe. Stacks of paper, bundled and wrapped in oilcloth. Gold certificates, hundreds of them, exactly as the newspaper had described. More money than Caleb had ever seen in one place, more than he'd earned in several lifetimes of ranching. But it wasn't just money. Lying on top of the certificates was a sealed envelope, cream-colored and expensive, with one word written on it in Raymond's careful hand, Caleb. His uncle had known. Somehow Raymond had known that it would be Caleb who found this, that it would be Caleb who faced this choice. The envelope felt heavy in his hands, weighted with more than paper. He didn't open it yet. Instead, he sat in the cellar with the safe door open, staring at the fruits of his uncle's crime and the letter that might explain everything or nothing. Sarge pressed against his side, offering the simple comfort of presence. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the Montana sky in shades of fire. Inside the hidden cellar, time seemed to stop, balanced between past and future, between the man Raymond had been and the man Caleb needed to decide to become. Caleb took the letter up into the barn, into the fading daylight, before opening it. Somehow it felt wrong to read his uncle's final words in the darkness of the cellar where so many secrets had been kept. Sarge settled beside him as he carefully broke the seal. The handwriting was the same careful script from the journal, but shakier, written by an older man whose hands no longer held the steadiness they once had. "Caleb," it began, "if you're reading this, then you found what I could never bring myself to use or get rid of. I'd say I'm sorry, but the truth is more complicated than that. I'm sorry for a lot of things, but not all of them. I robbed that bank in June of 1963. Not with a gang that was a story I encouraged, by leaving that playing card, by moving quickly, by making them see what I wanted them to see. Just me, careful planning, and more nerve than I knew I had. Your grandfather had just died. My father, the railroad man who worked himself to death for a company that gave him a pension that wouldn't feed a cat. I watched him fade away, watched your grandmother try to smile while she worried about money, and something in me broke. I didn't do it for good reasons. I did it because I was angry and young and thought I was smarter than everyone else. And I was smart enough to get away with it, but not wise enough to understand what I was really stealing. The money's there, all of it. I never spent a single certificate. At first, I was waiting for the heat to die down. Then I was waiting for a good reason to spend it. Then I realized there wasn't one. How could I spend money that belonged to people who'd worked for it, saved it, trusted that it would be safe? How could I enjoy anything bought with that kind of theft? So I did something else instead. I built things. I helped people. I tried to pay back what I took, not in money but in labor and time and whatever skills I had. It wasn't enough, it could never be enough, but it was all I knew how to do. I chose to leave my family because I couldn't risk them knowing what I'd done. I couldn't look your father in the eye and pretend I was the honest man he believed me to be. The distance was my choice, my punishment, and my protection for all of you. If they'd caught me, you'd all have carried that shame. At least this way, you only carried my absence. Now it's yours. The money, the choice, the burden. I could have destroyed it. But that felt like wasting other people's sacrifice. I could have turned myself in, but 60 years later, what would that accomplish? The victims are gone. The bank is gone. Even the insurance company that paid the claim went bankrupt in the 80s. But the money's still real, still valuable. And I'm giving you the choice I never allowed myself to have. Use it, turn it in, burn it, whatever feels right to you. You were always the good one, Caleb. Even as a kid, you had a sense of fairness that I recognized because I'd lost it somewhere along the way. Your father saw it too. He was proud of you, prouder than he ever was of me. I built that barn to last because I wanted something permanent, something that would outlive my mistakes. Inside it, hidden below it, is my greatest failure, and my life's work, the money I stole and the shame I carried. I'm sorry I left you this puzzle. I'm sorry for a lot of things. But I'm not sorry I tried to do better, even if it was never good enough. Uncle Ray. Caleb read the letter 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of regret and rationalization, of pride and humility, mixed together in ways that resisted simple judgment. His uncle had been both more and less than Caleb had imagined, a criminal who'd punished himself more harshly than any court would have, a thief who'd spent 60 years trying to earn back what he'd stolen through means that could never quite balance the scales. He folded the letter carefully and tucked it back into the envelope. The weight of it felt different now. Not just paper, but the accumulated mass of a lifetime of choices made and unmade. That night, back at the motel, Caleb couldn't sleep. He lay in the darkness, listening to Sarge's gentle snoring, thinking about inheritance and responsibility, and the ways the past reached forward to shape the present. His phone buzzed with a text from his ex-wife. "Lauren said you're still in Montana. Everything okay?" He stared at the screen for a long time before typing, "Just taking care of some things, nothing to worry about." The lie felt necessary. How could he explain this to anyone? He could barely explain it to himself. The next morning brought rain, a steady drizzle that turned the dirt road to mud and made the barn roof drum with a soothing rhythm. Caleb sat inside the structure, door open to the grey light, watching the rain while Sarge explored the perimeter. He'd been avoiding the obvious question. What was he going to do with the money? The practical part of his mind immediately went to his debts, his struggling ranch, the security that kind of fortune could provide. He could pay off the mortgage, upgrade his equipment, maybe even help his daughter buy a house. But using stolen money, even money stolen 6 decades ago from victims long dead, felt like accepting Raymond's crime as his own. It felt like saying that the ends justified the means, that need erased culpability. On the other hand, turning the money in seemed pointless. To whom would he turn it in? The local police? The FBI? And what would they do with it? Put it in an evidence locker for a case that was older than most of the agents investigating it. The legal complexities alone would take years to sort out, and in the end, the money would likely be absorbed by bureaucracy, doing no one any good. There was a third option, one that he kept circling back to despite its complications. Use the money, but not for himself. Give it away, anonymously, to people who needed it. Raymond had spent 60 years trying to pay back his debt through carpentry and kindness. Maybe Caleb could finish what his uncle had started, could find a way to return value to the community his uncle had served, but never quite joined. The rain intensified, and Caleb moved deeper into the barn to stay dry. He noticed something he'd missed before. Carved into one of the support beams, hidden in shadow, were initials and a date. R, M, V, and C, R, V. 1963. Raymond Michael Vance and Caleb Rusty Vance. His uncle had carved both their initials into the barn's structure when he'd built it, when Caleb had been just a teenager who'd lost his father and been abandoned by his only remaining uncle. Even then, in the midst of building his fortress of secrets, Raymond had been thinking about the nephew he'd left behind. It was a small thing, barely visible, but it shifted something in Caleb's understanding. His uncle hadn't just been hiding. He'd been building toward this moment, this inheritance, this choice. The barn wasn't just a vault. It was a message, a question posed across decades. What will you do with the burden I carried? Marcus Webb called that afternoon, his voice professionally cheerful despite the weather. Mr. Vance, I wanted to follow up on our conversation. Have you had time to consider our offer? I'm still thinking, Caleb said. Of course, but I should mention, we're looking at other properties in the area as well. This opportunity won't remain open indefinitely. Sometimes the best decision is the quick decision. Caleb felt a flash of irritation at the pressure tactic. I'll let you know when I've decided. After hanging up, he stood in the barn doorway, watching the rain, thinking about preservation and destruction, about secrets kept and burdens shared. The barn represented everything his uncle had been: flawed and careful, criminal and conscientious, isolated and somehow connected to the community he'd served. Tearing it down to make room for luxury cabins felt wrong in a way Caleb couldn't fully articulate. But keeping it meant keeping the secret, accepting the weight of Raymond's choices as his own inheritance. The rain continued through the evening, and Caleb stayed in the barn, dry and thoughtful, while Sarge slept peacefully in a corner. The safe remained open below, its contents untouched, waiting for a decision that Caleb still wasn't ready to make. Outside, the Montana wilderness stretched away in all directions, indifferent to human choices, patient in the way that only the natural world could be. And somewhere in that patience, Caleb felt the first stirrings of what might become a path forward, not easy, not simple, but perhaps honest, in the way his uncle had tried and failed to be. The rain stopped on the third day, leaving the world washed clean and bright. Caleb was in town picking up supplies when he saw her, an elderly woman, maybe 85 or 90, being helped out of a car at the diner. Something about her face caught his attention, a familiar cast to her features that he couldn't quite place. She noticed him staring and smiled, the kind of smile that suggested she was used to being looked at. "You're Raymond Vance's nephew," she said, not a question but a statement of fact. Her voice was clear despite her age, with an accent that spoke of education and careful speech. "Yes, ma'am, Caleb Vance. I'm Eleanor Pritchard, Douglas Pritchard's mother." She gestured to a table. "Would you join me for coffee? I knew your uncle quite well, and I'd like to talk with you, if you have the time." Something in her tone suggested this wasn't a casual invitation. Caleb glanced at his truck, where Sarge waited patiently, then nodded. "I'd like that." They settled at a corner booth, and Eleanor ordered coffee for both of them with the confidence of someone who'd been making decisions for herself for a very long time. Up close, Caleb could see that she'd been beautiful once, and remained striking sharp blue eyes that missed nothing, silver hair pulled back in an elegant knot, hands that trembled slightly, but moved with purpose. "Your uncle and I were friends," she said once the coffee arrived. "Not close friends, perhaps, but friends nonetheless. I was the town librarian for 43 years, and Raymond was one of my most faithful patrons. Every 2 weeks, like clockwork, he'd come in for books. History mostly, architecture, philosophy. He had a curious mind." "I didn't know that," Caleb said, trying to picture his reclusive uncle browsing library shelves. "Most people didn't know much about Raymond. He was careful about what he shared." Eleanor paused, her fingers wrapped around the coffee cup. "But sometimes, over the years, he'd stay and talk after selecting his books. Small things, at first comments about the weather, observations about the town, then, gradually, deeper conversations. About regret, about the weight of choices, about whether a man could ever truly make amends for the wrong he'd done." Caleb's pulse quickened. "Did he tell you about the robbery?" Eleanor's smile was sad. "Not in so many words. Raymond was too careful for that. But I was the librarian, Mr. Vance. I was here in 1963. I remembered the robbery, remembered the investigation, remembered when a quiet young man with carpentry skills moved to town just months after the Phantom Gang disappeared." "You knew," Caleb said softly. "All those years, you knew." "I suspected. There's a difference. I had no proof, and I'm not sure I wanted any. What would knowing for certain have accomplished? Raymond never hurt anyone. He never took another thing. He worked hard, lived simply, and tried, God knows he tried to be better than the worst thing he'd ever done." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small photograph, its edges worn from handling. "He gave me this about 10 years ago, said I should have it in case anything happened to him." The photograph showed 2 people standing in front of the library, a much younger Raymond, maybe in his 30s, and a woman Caleb recognized as a younger Eleanor. They weren't touching, weren't even standing particularly close, but something in their expressions suggested a connection deeper than the casual friendship Eleanor had described. "We had a brief romance," Eleanor said, her voice matter-of-fact about something that must have carried considerable emotion. 1971 to 73. I thought perhaps we might marry. I was divorced, lonely, and Raymond was kind in ways that didn't always show on the surface, but he ended it. Said he couldn't give me the life I deserved, that he carried too much darkness to share with anyone. "Because of the money," Caleb said. "Because of the guilt. The money was just the evidence of it." Eleanor's eyes grew distant with memory. "I was angry at first, hurt, but over the years, as I watched him live, watched him work himself nearly to death for others, I came to understand. Raymond had sentenced himself to a loneliness more complete than any prison. He'd built a cage of his own choosing and locked himself inside it." She pulled out another item from her purse, a sealed envelope similar to the one Caleb had found in the safe. His name was written on it in Raymond's hand. "He gave me this 5 years ago," Eleanor said, sliding it across the table. "Made me promise to give it to you if you ever came to Cedar Ridge. He said you'd come eventually, that you'd find what he'd hidden, and that you'd need more than one letter to understand." Caleb took the envelope with shaking hands. "Did you know what was in the barn?" "I guessed. Raymond asked me once, in an abstract way, what I thought someone should do if they had something that belonged to others but couldn't return it without destroying themselves. I told him the truth that I didn't know, that there are questions without good answers." She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. Her skin was paper-thin, spotted with age, but her grip was firm. "Open it later, when you're ready. But know this, your uncle loved you, Caleb. He talked about you sometimes, wondered about the man you'd become. He had great regrets about leaving your family, but he was proud of you from a distance." How could he be proud? He didn't know me. He knew you were honest, hard-working, that you'd built a life through integrity rather than shortcuts. For a man who'd taken the biggest shortcut of all, those qualities meant everything. They talked for another hour, Eleanor sharing stories about Raymond that painted a picture Caleb had never seen: a man who'd read extensively, who'd had opinions about politics and philosophy, who'd once spent an entire winter teaching a troubled teenager woodworking skills that kept the boy out of jail. A man who'd been more than his worst decision. When they parted, Eleanor held Caleb's hand once more. "Whatever you decide to do, I hope you'll do it with compassion for yourself as much as for Raymond. His burden was heavy enough. Don't make it heavier by taking all of it onto your own shoulders." Back at the motel, Caleb opened the second letter. This one was longer, written over multiple pages and dated from 5 years earlier, when Raymond had apparently known his time was growing short. "Caleb," it read, "if Eleanor has given you this, then you've found the money and you've read my first letter. Now I need to tell you the rest of the truth, the part I was too ashamed to include before. I wasn't alone in the robbery. There was another person, not a partner in the crime itself, but someone who knew what I'd done and helped me hide it. My father, your grandfather. He died 2 months before the robbery, but before he passed, we had a conversation that changed everything. He told me he regretted his entire life of honest labor, that he'd given the railroad 40 years and had nothing to show for it but worn-out hands and a pension that wouldn't support his widow. He said if he had it to do over, he'd be smarter, would take what he could get instead of accepting what they chose to give him. I think he was just bitter, just a dying man's angry rambling. But it planted a seed. After he died, watching my mother struggle, watching your father try to keep the family afloat while working 3 jobs, I convinced myself I was doing it for them. That I'd share the money, help them secretly, be the brother and son they deserved. But when I actually pulled it off, when I had the money, I realized I couldn't do it, couldn't taint them with my crime, couldn't risk them being caught up in it if I was discovered. So I hid it, and I hid myself, and I let them think I was just a selfish bastard who'd abandoned his family. The barn, I built it the way my father taught me to build. Every joint, every beam, it's his training in my hands. It's my monument to him and my prison because of him. Does that make sense? I built my cage with the skills he gave me, trying to honor him while hating what his bitterness had inspired in me. I don't know if he really meant it, what he said about taking what you can get. I don't know if the robbery was my betrayal of his values or my fulfillment of his secret wishes. I've spent 60 years trying to figure that out, and I still don't have an answer. But here's what I do know. The money is cursed, not in any supernatural way, but in the way that stolen things always carry the weight of their theft. Every certificate is marked by the fear in those bank tellers' eyes, by the violation of trust, by the selfishness of a young man who thought he knew better than everyone else. If you use it, it will change you, not because money itself is corrupting, but because you'll always know where it came from. If you return it, you'll feel righteous for a while, but that will fade, and you'll be left with the knowledge that you gave up security for principle, a noble choice, but a hard one to live with when times are difficult. There's no good answer here, Caleb. I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for all of it. But I trust you to do what I couldn't make a choice and live with it honestly, without the decades of hiding and self-punishment that I chose. Whatever you decide, be at peace with it. Don't let it become what it became for me. Your uncle, who loved you more than you knew. Caleb sat in the dim motel room, both letters spread before him, and felt the full weight of his inheritance settle onto his shoulders. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about family legacy, about the choices that echo through generations, about his grandfather's bitterness and his uncle's crime and his own father's honest struggle. All of it connected, all of it leading to this moment where Caleb had to decide what kind of man he would be when faced with the same temptation that had destroyed his uncle's life. Caleb spent the next 2 days in a state of suspended decision, walking the property, sitting in the barn, reading and rereading his uncle's letters until he could recite them from memory. Sarge stayed close, seeming to sense that something important was happening, offering the kind of steady presence that asked nothing and gave everything. On the 3rd morning, Caleb drove into Cedar Ridge with a purpose he hadn't fully articulated to himself yet. He stopped first at the library, where Eleanor was volunteering at the front desk, despite her age. "I need to understand something," he said without preamble. "The people who were in the bank that day, the tellers, the customers, are any of them still alive?" Eleanor's expression grew thoughtful. "The bank manager died in '98, 2 of the 4 customers passed in the '80s. But Margaret Sullivan, she was a teller. She's in the nursing home now, must be 94 or 95. And James Keller, he was a customer, moved to Billings, but I heard he's still living. Why do you ask?" "I need to know what the robbery cost them, beyond the money." Eleanor studied him for a long moment. Margaret never fully recovered from the fear. She told me once that she still had nightmares about masked men and guns, even 40 years later. It marked her, made her cautious and anxious in ways she hadn't been before. The money was insured, replaced, but the fear that stayed. Caleb thanked her and drove to the nursing home on the edge of town. The facility was clean but institutional, filled with the particular quiet of places where people came to live out their final years. Margaret Sullivan was in a sunny room overlooking a garden, a tiny woman with white hair and hands twisted by arthritis. He introduced himself, explained that he was researching local history for a project. He didn't mention Raymond, didn't reveal his true connection to the story, but he asked about the robbery. Margaret's eyes grew distant, slipping into memory with the ease of the very old who sometimes live more in the past than the present. "I was 26, she said, her voice reedy but clear. "Engaged to be married. It was supposed to be my last month at the bank. I was going to quit after the wedding, be a housewife like women did then." "What do you remember about that day?" "Everything. Every detail. Like it happened this morning instead of 60-some years ago. 3 men, I thought, though the police later said maybe it was fewer. They were so calm, so professional. They knew exactly what they wanted. The one who spoke, his voice wasn't cruel or angry. He was almost polite about it. "Nobody needs to be a hero today," he said. "Just do what you're told, and everyone goes home safe." Her hands trembled in her lap. "We did what they wanted." Afterwards, my hands shook so badly I couldn't hold a glass of water. My fiancé wanted to move away, start fresh somewhere else. But I refused. I told him I wouldn't let fear drive me from my home. "Did you marry him?" "I did, 52 years before he passed. We had 3 children, 8 grandchildren. I worked at the bank another 35 years after that robbery. Outlasted 3 managers and 2 different owners before they finally closed." She looked directly at Caleb. "People ask if I'm bitter about it, if I hate whoever took that money. But here's the truth. I'm 94 years old. I've outlived most of my fears and all of my grudges. That young man, or those young men, whoever they were, they stole money that wasn't mine, frightened me badly, but they didn't take my life. They didn't take the things that mattered. In the end, I think they probably hurt themselves more than they hurt us." The wisdom in her words followed Caleb back to his truck, sat with him as he drove through town, stayed with him as he returned to the barn. She was right, of course. The robbery had caused fear and disruption, but it was Raymond who'd paid the highest price. 60 years of isolation, of self-imposed exile, of building a life around a hollow center. That afternoon, Marcus Webb called again, his voice carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. "Mr. Vance, I need to be direct with you. We have other properties we're considering, and we need to make a decision by the end of the week." If you're not interested in selling, just tell me so we can move on. I'm considering it, Caleb said. Well, consider faster. And let me be clear, the offer we discussed was based on current market conditions. If you wait much longer, those conditions may change. Opportunities have expiration dates. After hanging up, Caleb felt a flash of the same anger he'd felt when he first learned about the money. Everyone wanted something from him, wanted his decision, his property, his cooperation, but nobody wanted to sit with the complexity of what he'd inherited, the impossible choice between competing goods. He called his daughter that evening, keeping the conversation light, asking about her work and her friends. At the end, she said something that lodged in his mind. "You sound different, Dad. Stressed or something. Are you sure everything's okay?" "Just got a lot to think about, honey." "Well, don't overthink it. You always do that. Turn simple things into philosophical problems. Sometimes the right choice is just the obvious one." If only that were true, Caleb thought after they said goodbye. But nothing about this situation was obvious or simple. He returned to the barn the next morning with a notebook and a clear head, determined to work through the problem methodically. He sat on the floor and made lists, arguments for different courses of action, consequences of each choice, the ripple effects he could anticipate and those he couldn't. Keep the money for himself. Financial security, ability to help his daughter save his ranch. But also guilt, the knowledge of where it came from, the risk of discovery, the fundamental dishonesty of benefiting from theft. Turn it in, clear conscience, doing the legally correct thing. But pointless, no victims to compensate, no justice to serve after 6 decades, money likely absorbed by bureaucracy. Use it for good. Anonymous donations, help people who need it, finish what Raymond tried to do. But still using stolen money, still making himself complicit, still the weight of knowing. Destroy it. Ultimate rejection of the crime, refusing to benefit or allow anyone to benefit, but wasteful, almost spiteful, solving nothing. The problem, Caleb realized, wasn't finding the right answer. The problem was that there wasn't one. Every choice carried costs and consequences that couldn't be neatly resolved. This was what Raymond had lived with, the understanding that he'd put himself in a position where no choice was clean, where every path forward involved compromise with principles that shouldn't be compromised. While wrestling with these thoughts, Caleb noticed something he'd overlooked before. In the corner of the barn, almost hidden by shadow, was a small wooden box similar to the one that had held the carpenter's level. He retrieved it and opened it carefully. Inside was a collection of items that told a story. Photographs of carpentry projects Raymond had completed, letters from community members thanking him for his work, a medal from the town council for outstanding community service, given in 1985. There was a child's drawing, obviously old, showing a stick figure labeled Mr. Ray next to a bookshelf, with the words, "Thank you for my shelves," written in crayon. But the most revealing item was, at the bottom, a leather-bound ledger, meticulously maintained. It was a record of every job Raymond had done, every payment received, and beside each entry, a calculation. He'd tracked the total value of his labor over 60 years, adjusting for inflation, computing how much he'd given back to the community in free work and discounted services. The final entry, dated just months before his death, showed a total of $127,000 in labor given freely or below cost. Raymond had been trying to pay it back, dollar by dollar, hour by hour, joint by joint. He'd spent his entire life attempting to balance a scale that could never truly be balanced, doing mathematics of atonement that had no solution. Caleb sat with the ledger in his hands, understanding flooding through him. This was his uncle's real legacy, not the money in the safe, but the decades of work, the attempt to transform theft into gift, crime into service. It was flawed, incomplete, insufficient, but it was also deeply, achingly human. Sheriff Bridger's truck appeared on the road around noon, dust trailing behind it. Caleb watched him approach, wondering if somehow the secret had gotten out, if this was the moment when choice would be taken from his hands. But Bridger's manner was relaxed as he stepped out of the truck. "Thought I'd check in, see how you're doing. You've been out here quite a bit." "Just trying to figure things out," Caleb said. "That barn of Ray's is something, isn't it? Built to last. I helped him re-roof it once, maybe 15 years back. Must have been close to 80 years old then, but he scrambled around on that roof like a man half his age. Insisted on doing the work right, no shortcuts." Bridger smiled at the memory. He said buildings are like people. If they're built on a solid foundation, they can weather just about anything. Seems like my uncle had a lot of philosophy about his work. He did. I think the work meant more to him than just making a living. It was, I don't know, like he was trying to prove something, maybe to himself. Bridger paused, choosing his words carefully. "Look, I don't know what you found out here, or what decisions you're facing. But I'll tell you what I told Ray once when he seemed troubled by something he wouldn't talk about. The past is fixed, but how we carry it forward, that's where we have some choice. We can't undo what's been done, but we can decide what it means, how it shapes what comes next." After Bridger left, Caleb stood looking at the barn his uncle had built, thinking about foundations and weather, and the ways people try to make amends for things that can't be fully repaired. The sun was setting again, painting the mountains in familiar shades of gold and amber, and somewhere in the beauty of that ordinary moment, Caleb felt himself moving toward a decision. Caleb woke before dawn on what he'd decided would be his last day in Cedar Ridge, with the full weight of his decision settled in his chest. Not comfortable, but final. He'd chosen a path that would honor both the crime and the atonement, the theft and the decades of repayment. It wasn't perfect, but perfection wasn't available in this situation. He dressed quickly, fed Sarge, and drove to the barn in the grey light of early morning. The property looked different somehow, as if his decision had changed the way he saw it, no longer mysterious or threatening, but simply a place where one man had tried to build something lasting from the ruins of his worst mistake. Down in the cellar, Caleb carefully removed the bundles of gold certificates from the safe. They were remarkably well preserved, wrapped in oilcloth, and stored in a space that had maintained stable temperature and humidity for 6 decades. He carried them up into the barn and laid them out on the floor in neat stacks, counting as he went. $112,000 in certificates, exactly as the newspaper had reported. Each certificate was ornate, printed on heavy paper with elaborate scrollwork and the promise of redemption in gold. They were beautiful in their way, artifacts of a different era when money meant something more tangible than electronic numbers in a database. He photographed several of the certificates with his phone, noting the serial numbers, the dates, the distinctive markings. Then he carefully repacked them and returned all but $10,000 worth to the safe. Those he set aside, wrapped separately, with a specific purpose in mind. The remaining amount, $102,000, he would handle differently. Not turn in to authorities, not keep for himself, but use to finish what Raymond had started. Anonymous gifts to the community, funding for projects that would benefit people who needed it, scholarships for kids who wanted to learn trades. He'd work through Eleanor, who could be trusted to keep the secret and distribute the money wisely over time. It would take years to give it all away safely, without raising questions, but Caleb had time, and more importantly, he had a model in his uncle's 6-decade commitment to making amends. This would be his inheritance, not the money itself, but the responsibility of transforming it from theft into gift. The $10,000 he'd set aside had a different purpose. He wrapped the certificates carefully and placed them in a padded envelope, then wrote an address he'd looked up the night before. James Keller, the last surviving customer from the bank that day. The man would be in his 90s now, living in Billings with his daughter. Caleb would mail it anonymously with a simple note. What was taken can never be fully returned, but this is a start. From someone who knew the thief and his regret. Would it help? Would it mean anything to a man in his final years? Caleb didn't know. but it felt right to return something directly to someone who'd been there, who'd experienced the fear and violation, even if the money itself had been insured and replaced decades ago. Marcus Webb called at 9 o'clock, his voice tight with barely concealed frustration. "Mr. Vance, I need your answer. Today, we're finalizing our land acquisitions, and if you're not selling, we need to know now." "I'm not selling," Caleb said. The words felt good, felt right. "The property stays in the family." There was a pause on the other end, then Webb's voice shifted, became harder. "You're making a mistake. That land is barely worth the taxes you'll pay on it. That barn is a liability. You're being sentimental about something that has no practical value. Then it won't matter to you that I'm keeping it. Fine. Your loss." Webb hung up without goodbye, and Caleb felt a small surge of satisfaction. His uncle had built something that would outlast the developers and their plans, that would stand as a quiet monument to the possibility of redemption, however imperfect. He spent the rest of the morning cleaning out the cellar, removing the last traces of the safe's presence. The safe itself would stay. It was far too heavy to move, and besides, it had become part of the structure, part of the story. But he filled the space around it with earth and rock, obscuring it from casual discovery, making it once again a secret known only to those who needed to know. Sarge supervised the work with his usual attentive presence, occasionally offering encouragement in the form of tail wags and gentle nudges. When Caleb finally climbed back up into the barn, muscles aching from the physical labor, the dog greeted him as if he'd been gone for hours rather than minutes. "We're going home soon, boy," Caleb said, scratching behind Sarge's ears. "But first, we have one more thing to do." That evening he drove to Eleanor's house, a small cottage on a quiet street lined with cottonwoods. She invited him in, offered tea, and listened without interruption as he explained his plan. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, her sharp eyes studying his face. "Your uncle would be proud," she finally said, "and grateful. This is better than he managed. More complete. It's not perfect. Perfection isn't available to any of us, Caleb. We're all just doing the best we can with the mistakes we've made and the grace we've been given." She smiled, an expression that held both sadness and approval. "I'll help you. It will be my last service to Raymond, and my first to you." The next morning, Caleb drove to the post office in Cedar Ridge and mailed the envelope to James Keller. The clerk, a cheerful woman in her 50s, took it without question, and Caleb felt a weight lift as it left his hands. One piece of the stolen fortune returned to someone who'd been there, who'd lived with the memory of that violation. It wasn't enough. It could never be enough, but it was something. He returned to the barn one last time, walking the perimeter slowly, memorizing the details. The way the light fell through the gaps in the roof boards, creating patterns on the dusty floor. The solid feel of the timber frame, joints still tight after 6 decades. The smell of old wood and earth and secrets kept in the back corner, where Sarge had first discovered the false floor. Caleb found something he'd missed in all his earlier searches. Carved into the wall at baseboard level, hidden unless you were on your knees looking for it, was a message in Raymond's careful script. "Build on honest foundations, even when starting from dishonest ground. The structure matters more than the first mistake. 1963 to 2024. His uncle had left this message, knowing that someday someone would find it. Knowing that the barn itself was a lesson that you could take something built from wrong choices and transform it through time and effort into something that served a better purpose. Caleb pulled out his pocket knife and added his own inscription below his uncle's. Continued by CRV 2024, the work goes on. It felt right. This small act of connection across the years, this acknowledgement that he was now part of the story, part of the attempt to transform theft into restitution. He replaced the loose floorboards carefully, restoring the false floor to its original position. The cellar below would remain hidden, the safe would stay in its darkness, but the money would flow out slowly, anonymously, doing the work Raymond had always meant it to do. Sheriff Bridger stopped by as Caleb was loading the last of his belongings into the truck. "Heading out?" he asked. "Time to get back to my own ranch. Got cattle that need tending. What are you going to do with this place?" Caleb looked at the barn, solid against the Montana sky. "Keep it, pay the taxes, maintain it, maybe come back once in a while to check on things. It's family property. Feels wrong to let it go." Bridger nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Your uncle would appreciate that. He put a lot of himself into this place." He paused, then added, "If you ever need anything repairs, someone to keep an eye on it, let me know. Cedar Ridge takes care of its own, even the ones who leave." They shook hands, and Caleb felt the simple warmth of community, the network of small kindnesses that Raymond had been part of, despite his isolation. His uncle had belonged here in ways that transcended his secrets, had earned a place through decades of careful work. Before leaving town, Caleb stopped at the library one last time. Eleanor was at her usual post, and she smiled when she saw him. "You're leaving," she said. "For now. I'll be back. There's work to do here. I'll be waiting." And Caleb, she reached across the desk and squeezed his hand. "Thank you for seeing your uncle clearly. Not just the crime, but the man who carried it. That's a gift you've given him, and yourself." "I learned from you," he said. "You saw him that way for 60 years. Love does that," she said simply. "It sees the whole person, not just the worst moment." The drive back to Wyoming was long and gave Caleb plenty of time to think. Sarge slept in the passenger seat, exhausted from the days of exploration and change. The landscape rolled past mountains, giving way to plains, pine forests to grassland, the big sky country that had shaped both him and his uncle in different ways. He thought about the choices ahead, the careful work of distributing the money without raising questions, the years of quiet restitution that would mirror Raymond's own efforts. It would be a second job alongside his ranching, a hidden purpose that few would ever know about. But that was all right. The best work was often done quietly, without recognition or acclaim. Raymond had understood that, had lived it for 60 years. Now Caleb would carry it forward, would be the keeper of both the secret and the atonement. His phone buzzed with a text from his daughter. "When are you coming home? I miss you." He smiled and voice texted back, "On my way. Be there tomorrow. Love you." The simple exchange grounded him, reminded him that he had his own life to live, his own choices to make beyond the inheritance of his uncle's mistakes. He could carry this burden without letting it consume him, could honor Raymond's memory without becoming Raymond, isolated and alone. That was the real lesson, he realized. Not that you couldn't make mistakes, couldn't fail, or fall short, but that you could keep trying to do better, keep building on honest foundations, even when starting from dishonest ground, keep reaching toward grace, even knowing you might never fully arrive. 3 months later, Caleb stood in his own barn on a crisp Wyoming morning, mending a saddle while Sarge dozed in a patch of sunlight. The work was familiar, honest, the kind of task that let his mind wander while his hands stayed busy. He'd been doing a lot of that lately, working and thinking, thinking and working, finding a rhythm between the two. The envelope had arrived last week, forwarded from Eleanor. Inside was a brief note on elegant stationery, written in a shaky hand. "I received your package. I don't know who you are or how you came by those certificates, but I want you to know that the gesture meant more than the money. I was 28 years old the day of that robbery, newly married, with my whole life ahead of me. The fear passed eventually, but I never forgot the feeling of being helpless while someone took what didn't belong to them. What you sent won't erase that memory. Nothing can. But knowing that whoever took it or their family felt enough regret to return even a small part of it, that helps. It tells me that conscience still matters, that guilt can lead to grace. I've donated the money to a scholarship fund for young people studying criminal justice. Perhaps someone who receives it will grow up to prevent the kind of fear I experienced, or perhaps they'll learn that redemption is possible even for those who make terrible choices." Thank you for the reminder that it's never too late to try to make things right, even imperfectly. James Keller. Caleb had read the letter a dozen times, each reading revealing new layers of forgiveness and understanding. Keller could have been bitter, could have demanded more, could have reported the mysterious return to authorities. Instead, he'd chosen to transform it again, to keep the cycle of redemption moving forward. That seemed to be the lesson in all of this, that redemption wasn't a single act, but a continuing choice, a commitment to building something better from the wreckage of mistakes. His own ranch was doing better now, though not from any stolen money. Caleb had taken a hard look at his operation, made some difficult decisions, sold off cattle he couldn't afford to keep through another winter. The place was smaller now, but more sustainable, more honest. He'd learned from watching his uncle's ledgers, from seeing how Raymond had built a life not on the theft, but on the work that followed it. Eleanor called once a month with updates. The first anonymous donation had gone to the town's food bank, funding a new commercial kitchen. The second had paid for new band instruments at the middle school. Small things, but meaningful. The kind of investments Raymond had made through his carpentry now continued through the careful distribution of what he'd stolen. People wonder where the money's coming from, Eleanor had told him during their last call, her voice carrying a hint of amusement. They've started calling it the Cedar Ridge Angel. If they only knew. Maybe it's better they don't, Caleb had said. Maybe. Or maybe someday, when enough time has passed, the story can be told not as a justification of theft, but as an example of how people carry their mistakes and try to make amends. Your uncle's story, honestly told, might help someone else facing similar choices. Caleb wasn't sure about that yet. The secret still felt heavy, even though sharing it with Eleanor had lightened the burden. Perhaps someday, when he was old and the principals were all gone, he could tell it fully. Or perhaps it would remain a family mystery, a barn in Montana that held more secrets than anyone would ever know. His daughter visited more often now, though she didn't know why he seemed different, more settled in himself. She just knew something had changed during his time in Montana, that he'd come back quieter but also more present, less distracted by worries about the past or future. "You seem happier, Dad," she'd said during her last visit, "more at peace." "I learned some things about my uncle," he'd told her, "about family, about the choices we make and how we live with them." That was true, if incomplete. He'd learned that people were more than their worst decisions, that redemption was possible even if it took a lifetime, that grace could be extended even to those who didn't deserve it. He'd learned that he could carry a burden without being crushed by it, could honor the past without being imprisoned by it. The carpenter's level sat on a shelf in his workshop now, the brass polished to a warm glow, the rosewood maintained with the same care Raymond had given it. Caleb used it sometimes in his own projects, feeling the weight of family history in his hands, the connection across generations of men who'd worked with their hands and tried, imperfectly, to build lives worth living. He'd added his own tools to the collection, his father's old hammer, his grandfather's measuring tape, implements that carried their own histories of honest labor. They sat together, a small monument to work and family and the ways people tried to make their marks on the world. Sometimes, late at night when the ranch was quiet and Sarge was sleeping, Caleb thought about his uncle in that barn, building and maintaining his fortress of secrets, trying to pay back what could never be fully repaid. He thought about the loneliness of it, the decades of self-imposed exile, the weight of carrying that burden alone. And he was grateful that Eleanor had known, that the secret had been shared, that Raymond hadn't died completely alone with his crime. Grateful, too, that the burden was now distributed, that he and Eleanor were carrying it forward together, transforming it slowly from theft into gift. The work would take years, maybe decades. The money would flow out gradually, anonymously, doing good in ways that Raymond had dreamed of but never quite achieved. And when it was finally gone, when every dollar had been returned to the community in one form or another, perhaps then the safe could be sealed permanently, the cellar filled in, the barn allowed to stand as a simple monument to honest work and complicated redemption. But that was for the future. For now, Caleb had his ranch to run, his daughter to love, his dog to care for, and a secret purpose that gave shape to his days. He had inherited more than money from his uncle. He'd inherited a responsibility, a lesson, and a chance to finish what Raymond had started. Outside, the Wyoming wind swept across the grassland, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. Sarge stirred in his sleep, dreaming dog dreams of chasing and finding, and the simple joys of honest work. And Caleb returned to his saddle, his hands steady, his purpose clear, building on honest foundations even when starting from dishonest ground. The past couldn't be changed, but the future remained open, full of possibility and choice. That was enough. That was everything.